The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors, from north to south, the Chumash, Tutaviam, Kutanamuk, Sorano, Kulia, Heom Kuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, the river systems, the waters and islands of this land and of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, please visit the USC History Department website, where there's a very detailed land. So my name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And I want to welcome you all to this lecture, our final event of the spring semester, fall semester, sorry. What month is it even? Before we get started, just a couple of notes about Zoom protocols. For those of you joining us remotely, there will be an opportunity to ask questions and participate in the discussion after the lecture. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the window, and we'll call on you to ask your question by voice. You can write your questions in the chat. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom. When you're considering how to ask your question, just keep in mind that this is being recorded and the recording will be made widely available. So keep that in mind for privacy, if you have privacy. We would love to know where our virtual audience is joining us from. So please feel free to put in the chat where you're watching from. We always like to see how far our community stretches. And when I sit down, I'll make sure that the chat is enabled for you to do that. Okay. So now to introduce today's speaker, and for our audience in the room, thank you so much for being here, and please feel free to get seconds on your sandwiches and goodies. We are always giving food away at the end of our lectures, and I hope this will be the first one where we don't have any left over. Okay, now to introduce today's speaker, I'd like to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappelle Garanger in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC.
Thank you, Martha, and thanks especially to Martha for the preparation of this whole conference. Without her, we could not sitting here, so thanks, Martha. First of all, I just want to say this is the last event of our semester, which was a very kind of lively semester. We had various events from our fellows, and also we had a big conference on mass violence and the lasting impact on indigenous communities, where we brought together 30 different indigenous scholars from North America, South America, Hawaii, and Australia. And this was a very moving and also very impactful conference. And so we are now kind of ending the semester on an interesting topic, with an interesting topic, going back to the Holocaust. To introduce our speaker, so we welcome Sina Fabian, who is an assistant professor of 20th century German history with a focus on National Socialism at Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. want to sneak this in here. This is my alma mater where I did my BA there. However, she, before got her undergraduate and her master degree from the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, which is also in Germany. And she got this in history, medieval and modern history, but also had minors in journalism, English, and politics. She was a PhD fellow at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, which is near Berlin, and received a PhD in contemporary history from the University of Potsdam in 2015. A little bit of a surprise might be the topic of her dissertation, which is kind of a little bit far from what she will talk about today. So the title of her dissertation was, and now I have to translate because it was written in German, "The Boom During the Crisis or Within the Crisis, Consumerism, Tourism, and Driving in Western Germany and Great Britain from the 1970s till the 1990s. And the dissertation is already published with the Waldstein, a very well-known publishing house for history in Germany. She had various fellowships. For example, she was a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in London. She was a research fellow at the University of Augsburg, at the University of Hanover in Germany, and also a senior fellow at the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, which is a different Leibniz Institute than the one in Potsdam. She published beyond her dissertation something related to our topic today, which was a special issue on alcohol. She collated this together with one of the prominent Holocaust scholars in Germany, Michael Wild, in the peer-reviewed journal Historische Anthropologie, Historical Anthropology. And then she published also on perpetrator testimonies and the role alcohol played in West German post-war trials in the Journal for History in Germany, and then on wine festivals in Nazi Germany in historical anthropology, and then also on the relationships between brewing history and public relations in Weimar Germany before Nazism, in a book co-edited by Moritz Firmer and Pamela Sweat, Reshaping Capitalism in Weimar and Nazi Germany, which just appeared on Cambridge University Press. So, and there's more. So you have to figure it out and go on the website and see more publications of it. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sina Fabian, who is a visiting scholar at the center for now 3 months almost. Yeah, welcome Sina Fabian.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about aspects of my research here today. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. First, I would like to thank Wolf, Martha, and Mia, who unfortunately can't be here today, for so warmly welcoming me at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. What I'm presenting today is a work in progress, and it is very much inspired by the interviews of DVHA that I have been watching for the last several weeks. I'm going to start by saying a few words about my larger project and what I originally came here to research. I'll then talk about perpetrators and victims' use of alcohol during and after the Holocaust, and I will conclude with some thoughts on how analyzing the use of alcohol could help opening up new perspectives on victims' and perpetrators' experiences of and coping with the Holocaust. In my larger book project, I'm looking at the role alcohol played in Weimar and Nazi Germany, and Wolf already mentioned some topics that I will be looking at. I'm especially interested in alcohol's multiple and ambivalent functions and how the state, consumers, the teetotalist movement, and alcohol producers dealt with alcohol's role in German society. While the consumption of alcohol was often regarded as problematic and efforts were made to regulate it, there were also times when drinking was actively encouraged both in Weimar and Nazi Germany, and one of such events were the wine festivals that Wolf mentioned. The Second World War and the Holocaust play an important role in my project because the consumption of alcohol by German soldiers and Holocaust perpetrators was for various reasons encouraged, tolerated, or even actively encouraged. But it also had to be tightly controlled at the same time. Thus, the opposing goals collided head-on and had to be navigated, which is particularly interesting for me. Today, I'm going to talk about the reasons to encourage the consumption of alcohol during the Holocaust and its limitations. I'm doing this by closely looking at a particular unit, and that is Einsatzgruppe D. Thanks to Edward Westermann's important research, we know about alcohol's omnipresence and multiple functions during the Holocaust. He focused especially on alcohol's functions for celebratory rituals and for performing masculinity. As sociological and ethnological studies have shown, the effect alcohol has on individuals or on groups of people depends on a variety of factors and cannot be determined beforehand. Drinking does not automatically lead to aggression, for example. In order to deepen our understanding of the role alcohol played during the Holocaust on the perpetrators' side, case studies can help to analyze the particular situations and contexts in which and to what purpose alcohol was consumed or, equally important, not consumed. There are also practical aspects that need to be addressed, such as how members of the Einsatzgruppe got alcoholic beverages, for example. Did they organize it themselves, or was it distributed by the squad leaders? Einsatzgruppe D operated in Bessarabia, Transnistria, southern Ukraine, Crimea, and Northern Caucasus. The Einsatzgruppe was divided into Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos, which with about 100 men each. Down here you can see the routes taken by the different Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos. They didn't stop at the Crimean Peninsula, but got into Russia as well. So Krasnodar, the Northern Caucasus, all the way down to the Georgian border. The unit's commander was Otto Ohlendorf, who is often described as an archetypical SS-man. He rose to prominence during the Nuremberg Einsatzgruppen trial, in which he was the chief defendant. The trial was officially called the United States of America versus Otto Ohlendorf et al. Ohlendorf and some of the leading Einsatzgruppen D's personnel received death or long-term prison sentences. It was only in 1960, however, that Munich's district attorney's office started again to investigate the crimes of Einsatzgruppe D. They did it quite thoroughly, though, by investigating against more than 800 members of the Einsatzgruppe. The investigations led to the prosecution of 20 former members, which says a lot about West German courts' willingness to prosecute Nazi perpetrators even in the 1960s and 70s. The investigators, however, interrogated almost all members of the Einsatzgruppe who were still alive. These interrogations are the main source for my case study. I had no problem finding references to alcohol consumption in the documents, and this came up frequently. The sources, however, only offer the perpetrator's perspective on the role of alcohol. Following an integrated history of the Holocaust, my aim was or is to include testimonies of people who survived Einsatzgruppe D's killing spree. And there's no better place for that than the Visual History Archive here at USC. So this was the original idea of what I was going to look at during my stay here. However, finding survivors' testimonies who had encountered Einsatzgruppe D was not as easy as I had anticipated, despite having the best help one can get from VHA's curator, Crispin Brooks. With Crispin's help, I was able to find testimonies, but only very few mentioned alcohol in connection with the Einsatzgruppe, and I get to the reasons why this may be later. During my research, I nevertheless came across quite a number of interviews that discussed alcohol. Crispin Brooks created the index term alcohol in 2015 based on the notes indexes of the interviews took. Some made notes when the survivor talked about alcohol, but they had no appropriate term to index it yet. At the moment, there are 100 testimonies in which alcohol is mentioned by Holocaust survivors, and Crispin provided a list of additional 50 interviews that are not yet indexed. Together with the testimonies I found with different search strategies, I listened to about 200 interviews in which alcohol was discussed. While listening to these interviews, I realized that the way I had thought about alcohol in relation to the Holocaust was very much focused on the perpetrators' use of alcohol. The interviews revealed, however, that Jewish victims used alcohol during the Holocaust too, but they did it in quite different ways than the perpetrators. I mentioned in the beginning that I'm interested in alcohol's ambivalent functions. Looking both at perpetrators and victims sheds light on these different ways and purposes alcohol was used. It could be used to destroy lives, but also to save them. Alcohol, as well as other goods such as cigarettes, could also lead to interactions between perpetrators and victims. But unlike cigarettes, alcohol can significantly affect and alter people's behavior due to its influence on the central nervous system, resulting, for example, in the loss of self-control and the ability to judge and act correctly in certain situations. I start by giving an overview over the use of alcohol in Einsatzgruppe D. By operating just behind the front line, alcohol supply was never short for members of the Einsatzgruppe. They were in a somewhat comfortable position as their area of operation included Romania, Crimea, Northern Caucasus, which were important Rhine regions. In fact, one of the unit's tasks was to secure and produce alcohol beverages for the Wehrmacht and for their own use. This picture was taken near Krasnodar in Russia. Lothar Heimbach, member of the Sonderkommando SK-10A, noted on the back of this image, these are Russia's largest wine producers with 4 million bottles of wine and sparkling wine. Among them are prime wines such as Riesling, end of quote. And the Einsatzgruppe confiscated all these wine. Having access to high quality wines and sparkling wine, especially from Crimea, was something that former members of the Einsatzgruppe stressed even 20 years later during their interrogations. Some, however, also mentioned that they were not used to drinking wine and could not handle it in the beginning. None of the former Einsatzgruppe members, although statements vary regarding how much alcohol was available, none of the former Einsatzgruppe members complained that it wasn't enough. Ohlendorf personally took care of the alcohol supply. He wrote in a letter to his wife, and I quote, "We got 1,000 liters of red wine yesterday, just in case, vorsorglich. I ordered another 200 liters for tomorrow, 2,000 liters for tomorrow," end of quote. The unit had about 600 members, so these two deliveries alone came to 5 liters wine per person. Ohlendorf also mentioned in his letter that the Wehrmacht station headquarters would also get a share of the delivery. So cooperation and loyalty between the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppe could be improved by sharing alcohol supply and by frequently drinking together. Ohlendorf and other members of the Einsatzgruppe conceded that the consumption of alcohol was high among the men. One important function was to create comradeship. Einsatzgruppen were very heterogenic groups consisting of SS and SD personnel, members of police battalions, the Waffen-SS, but also included civilians such as mechanics, interpreters, motorcyclists, and drivers. The former members often described their unit as a wild bunch, ein wilder Haufen. Alcohol was therefore used in order to create some unity and comradeship. Johannes Schlupper was one of the leaders of Sonderkommando SK-11B. He was described in the interrogations as a good comrade. One member described him as follows, and I quote, "Schlupper was a comradely supervisor, ein kameradschaftlicher Vorgesetzter. If he had a bottle of liquor, he would always share it with everyone," end of quote. Being a good comrade, especially as an officer or supervisor, was extremely important in Nazi ideology, and it was constantly demanded by Nazi leaders such as Hitler and Himmler. Thus, even Otto Ohlendorf, who has been described as a loner and who often wrote to his wife that he preferred to be alone, also told her that it was his duty to socialize with his men. The results were long card game sessions in which, after which his room looked messy. Comradeship and socializing with the help of alcohol could also go in another direction. A member of SK11B remembered walking into a room where Schlupper and other members of the Sonderkommando were drinking and singing songs which were about beating Jews up and bashing their heads. This happened in Romania before the Einsatzgruppe had started to murder Jewish people. Alcohol was therefore also used to prepare the men for the murderous task and to create comradeship through violent fantasies against Jews. What role did alcohol play during the killing of Jewish people? This question has often been addressed. All the studies stressed that perpetrators always needed alcohol in order to kill innocent people and that they were mostly drunk during the mass killings. Newer studies, however, argue that alcohol was seldom necessary to participate in mass killings. Omar Bartov even argues that mass murders were mere, and I quote, background noise to drinking bouts or amorous relationships, end of quote. I agree with Edward Westerman, who stresses that alcohol was, in most cases, neither needed for participation in mass murder, nor was it the cause for atrocious behaviors by German perpetrators and local auxiliary forces. Coming back to Einsatzgruppe D, there were some cases in which alcohol seemed to be strategically distributed before and during mass killings. These were often the first mass shootings. Christopher Browning called them initiation to mass murder. In order to overcome the inhibition to murder, alcohol's disinhibiting effects were used. The officers in charge of the killings therefore provided alcohol for the shooters. Einsatzkommando 12's first mass shooting was in the Transnistrian town Dubosri. They killed approximately 4,000 Jews over 2 days. Max Drexel, who was in charge of the shooting, also organized schnapps for the shooters to drink. A local eyewitness remembered that the killers drank a lot of alcohol, which was set on the tables next to the shooting pit. When the platoon leader of a reserve police battalion who gave the orders to fire got sick, he was given alcohol and had cold water splashed in his face. One member of the firing squad described the effects the alcohol had on him as follows, quote, "It was just enough to get you fired up, angefeuert, a little, and to lose the inhibition that you had when carrying out the executions," end of quote. So in this case, alcohol had exactly the desired effect. This was not always the case, however. During a mass shooting in Odessa, the firing squad got so drunk that the men were just staggering around and couldn't aim anymore, and therefore had to be replaced. While alcohol was not commonly supplied before or during a mass killing, it was regularly offered afterwards during fellowship evenings. Whereas Heinrich Himmler explicitly did not want the men to get drunk, higher SS and police leader HSPF Erich von den Bach-Zelewski ordered that men who had taken part in mass killings should not be left alone. Instead, fellowship evenings had to be held in order to, quote, wipe out Verwischen the day's impressions, end of quote. And this could very well be achieved with the help of alcohol. The aforementioned Schlupper knew about Himmler's and von den Bach-Zelewski's orders in regard to the fellowship evening. He referred to it in the interrogations in order to justify the consumption of alcohol after mass killings. Regarding Einsatzgruppe D, I would argue that alcohol was in most cases given out after the shootings. This corresponds with the testimonies I found in the VHA. Jews who survived mass executions by Einsatzgruppe D or by other Einsatzgruppen rarely mention that the perpetrators were drunk. So some recall that they drank after the killing though. Most members of the Einsatzgruppe quickly got used to kill innocent people. It became their daily work. In order to normalize this not at all normal work, everyday routines were important. Thus, drinking after a mass killing could serve as an after-work drink, which did not necessarily lead to excessive drinking. One eyewitness recalled that 5 members of Einsatzgruppe D arrived at his workplace, killed approximately 125 Jews, cleaned themselves up, had a few drinks, and then left. When and how much alcohol was consumed depended on several factors. One important factor was the attitude the leader of the particular unit head towards alcohol. Bruno Müller, head of SK11B, was known as a heavy drinker who often demanded from his officers to play cards and drink with him all night. Consequently, there were more killings and atrocities in connection with alcohol in SK11B than in other units. One example was the shooting in Odessa. Müller also ordered his officers to drink and party with him all night in Benda, Bessarabia, before telling them that they had to carry out their first mass killing right away. There are comparatively few alcohol-related atrocities, such as killing for fun, torturing, and so on known from Einsatzgruppe D compared to German perpetrators in camps or ghettos. Members of the Einsatzgruppe were not more humane or more disciplined. They often simply lacked the opportunity to commit atrocities when drunk. Unlike camp guards, they usually did not have Jews imprisoned close by which they could torture and or kill if they felt like it after a few drinks. Furthermore, being relatively close to the front, it was forbidden and it was also dangerous to leave the quarters at night, especially when drunk. It happened nevertheless, of course. In some cases, members of the Einsatzgruppe were accidentally shot by their comrades or by German or Romanian soldiers because they were too drunk to remember the password. If members of the Einsatzgruppe were stationed in smaller units in the hinterland for a longer period of time, they quickly started to act like Herrenmenschen, which also included torturing and killing for fun with or without the influence of alcohol, as Omar Barthoff and Klaus-Michael Malmann have described. Edward Westermann rightly stressed the close connection between alcohol consumption and violence. While victims often suffered more when perpetrators were drunk, drunkenness sometimes also provided an opportunity to escape the perpetrators. Abraham Melizin, for example, managed to free himself from two drunk Germans who had plans to kill him. Malka Pishanitskaya and her mother survived 2 roundups by Einsatzgruppe C in Höchstädter. While in hiding, they only left their house briefly at night when, quote, everyone is drunk. At another incident, they accidentally hid in a house where Germans were partying. I quote again, one Nazi came out, stumbled over my foot, and came out from the house to bring up because they ate and they drank usually a lot of alcohol. So they got completely drunk, and that was our luck in this, end of quote. Research so far has mainly concentrated on the perpetrators' use of alcohol. VHA's testimonies show, however, that alcohol was also used by Jewish victims, but in quite different ways. While the perpetrators mostly consumed it for recreational purposes, alcohol was used by Jews mainly as a means to survive. Jews who were imprisoned in camps or ghettos mostly bartered alcohol for food instead of drinking it themselves. Alcohol is thus very often mentioned in connection with barter. Several interviews refer to one particular camp, the Pionki First Labor Camp in occupied Poland between Warsaw and Lublin. The Jewish forced laborers worked in an ammunition factory for the Germans where alcohol was needed to produce gunpowder. The factory therefore contained large tanks with high-grade alcohol. Some of it was denatured, but the rest was drinkable, although it contained about 96% of alcohol. Several survivors recall that they smuggled alcohol from the factory and bartered it with non-Jewish Polish workers or even with Germans for food. They filled the alcohol in small containers and hid it under their clothes. Daniel Markovich frequently siphoned off alcohol. Thanks to his smuggling activities, he made a lot of connections in the camp. He was able to get more food in return for alcohol. He also got a better job in the factory. He recalled that the camp guards were nicer to the Jewish prisoners when he was around because they hoped to get alcohol from him. His connections ultimately even saved him from transportation to Auschwitz. Luckily, he was never caught smuggling alcohol. Several survivors remember seeing people hanged frequently for drinking or smuggling alcohol. One survivor described it as a ceremony on Sundays when everyone who had been caught over the last week was hanged. Alcohol smuggling also happened in other camps, but it's equally dangerous. Henry Prochownik got a bottle of liquor from a civilian worker at Auschwitz III Monowitz, where they both worked at the Guna factory. He was caught when he tried to bring the bottle back to the camp. As a punishment, he was hung up with his hands tied on his back for several hours. Another survivor found a bottle of alcohol at the so-called Canada Lager in Auschwitz, where the belongings of arriving and murdered Jews were stored. He was also caught and severely bitten by the guards' dogs. Despite the danger, many survivors nevertheless bartered alcohol for food if they had the chance, because it helped them and their family members to survive. Another common way of survivors' use of alcohol was to produce moonshine and then sell it illegally on the black market. Minna Aspler lived under a false Christian identity in Warsaw. She was about 20 at the time, had no family to rely on. She worked in the library, but sold moonshine on the side. She describes in her testimony how she and her friends produced and sold alcoholic beverages. And I'll play a clip from it now. I hope that
I was dealing with vodka illegally, with vodka and liqueurs. And in his basement, he would make vodka. He would buy the old bottles, empty bottles, and fill and make his own liquor. And I was going to restaurants and selling it because restaurants were open. The Christians had a good time. They didn't worry about ghetto or hunger or whatever. So they would buy liquor from me. But I had to take out from this fellow, Andrzej, from his basement, take to the house. From the house, I had to carry it to the restaurant. 5 bottles here, 3 bottles there. In the library, I was selling vodka under the counter. People used to come for books, and they would say, Maria, give me a bottle of vodka, and I would sell the vodka. And I was dealing with vodka illegally, with vodka and his basement, take to the house. From the house, I had to carry it to the restaurant. 5 bottles here, 3 bottles there. In the library, I was selling vodka under the counter. People used to come for books, and they would say, Maria, give me a bottle of vodka, and I would sell the vodka, and we would all share like the 4 of us, whatever we made, we would share. The interesting thing is that everybody wanted to make a living from nothing. We had to make a living. I'll
come back to the video in a second. So Minna gives us a glimpse into the different world Jews, non-Jewish Poles, and German occupiers lived. Through alcohol, these worlds sometimes met and overlapped. So the Germans who frequented the nice restaurants in Warsaw might have consumed alcohol that a Jewish woman posing as a Christian had supplied. Minna also remarks on the dangers she faced. Living under a false Christian identity, it would have been best to lay low and not to attract any attention. Instead, she became well known as an illegal alcohol seller, increasing the risk of being caught and her true identity exposed. She was also often asked to drink with other people, such as the family she lived with, for example. They knew she was selling alcohol illegally, so they sometimes asked her for a bottle and invited her to drink with them. Quote, I had to show that I'm not Jewish, I know how to drink, end of quote. In the clip you will see now, she reflects on the dangers of being drunk.
Drunk. And I will still remember not to talk about myself. I will say anything, joke, laugh. It is unbelievable, the strength of people who want to survive. You want to survive, and you yourself, now when I talk about this, admire myself for the strength, I must admit. Really, because I was often drunk.
Losing self-control as a Jew could have fatal consequences. Among perpetrators, the loss of self-control sometimes explicitly intended with the consumption of alcohol. Even if it wasn't intended, there were barely any consequences if it happened. Some Jewish survivors recall that they also used alcohol to interact with perpetrators, often in the form of bribery. Clara Biermann, her mother and her siblings were able to escape from the Bogdanovka concentration camp in Transnistria by bribing Ukrainian camp guards with vodka. Thereby, they were able to escape a mass killing which lasted for several days around Christmas and New Year's Eve in 1941. The killings were carried out by Romanian soldiers, Ukrainian police forces, and Volksdeutsche Sondergruppe. They murdered 40,000 people. According to Clara Biermann, she and her family were able to escape on December 31st. It was the last day of the mass killing, and most perpetrators were already drunk. Sima Kravetsky and his mother were also able to escape the Bogdanovka camp by bribing the guards with 2 bottles of vodka before the killing began. Some survivors used alcohol strategically in order to build relationships with the perpetrators and their auxiliary forces. Mark Grinhams recalls how he was able to save himself and his then girlfriend, later wife Dorothy, from a mass killing action.
Now, when they surrounded that ghetto, I already had papers made up for me in Dorothy. And I went to, now what I did, I established some good communication with some policemen. I drank with them, just in case. So I tried to be pally with them, you know, drink with them, talk to them. They came to my house, I gave them some soap, I gave them this and that. So in case of something, to let me know what happens. Now, when they surrounded the ghetto, I saw one of the policemen that I just drank last night, and I asked him to let me out to Dorothy. And he says, no, I'll let you out, but I didn't let her out. So I said, forget it. So I went to another guy that I maybe drank 2 weeks ago, and I gave him 5 gold pieces, and I said, let me out. So he did. And that's
Barter, black market activity, and bribery were the most common way to use alcohol during the war mentioned by Jewish survivors. Moving from the perpetrators' consumption of alcohol to the victims' use emphasizes Jewish agency and behavior during the Holocaust. They were not just victims of perpetrators' alcohol consumption, but used it themselves to establish potential helpful networks, to improve their living conditions, or even to escape certain death. Drinking or dealing with alcohol was dangerous, however, and could have fatal consequences. We have already seen Minna Aspler reflecting on the strength and self-control she had to have in order to be able to engage in the dangerous black market activities as a young girl. Leonard Lehrer makes similar remarks. After recalling how he sneaked into the German canteen in Flossenburg concentration camp to steal beer, which he then bartered for food, he goes on to explain, right, you had to risk your life in order to do something. Otherwise, you sit back, and if you gave up, forget it. You will not last in that world for too long. And now move on to the use of alcohol after the Holocaust. And I would like to start this by the section by saying a few words about this photograph.
now when they surrounded that ghetto,
That you saw on the invitation. It depicts Polish prisoners in Dachau toasting their liberation from the camp. And I chose this image because it is an unusual setting. We are used to images of German soldiers celebrating during the war with alcohol, which sometimes look quite similar. And here we have survivors celebrating their liberation and survival with champagne. And this image also depicts the transition from war to post-war that I would like to focus on now. Some Jewish survivors continued to use alcohol in a very similar way after the war. Barter, black market activities, and bribery were still the most common ways of alcohol use in the immediate post-war years. Soviet soldiers were now the preferred target group of liberated Jews in Eastern Europe. Max Kugler's father sold alcohol on the black market. He records, quote, vodka would buy you anything. They would sell Stalin for a bottle of vodka. Jewish survivors were often displaced and had lost all their belongings, but they had to make a living, to quote Minna Aspler. The black market was a risky but also lucrative business, and alcohol, as well as cigarettes, were much sought after goods. They also functioned as currency on the black market. Alcohol was further used to bribe officials such as border patrols. It helped survivors either to move east in search of surviving relatives or to go west trying to escape Soviet occupation. It was still dangerous, especially dealing on the black market, but it was much less dangerous compared to German occupation. If we're coming to alcohol as a coping mechanism now, there are some studies that discuss how perpetrators coped with the atrocities they committed. As I mentioned in the beginning, all the studies argued that they used alcohol as a coping mechanism. And I agree with Ed Westerman, however, that most perpetrators did not need alcohol in order to cope with the killings. The atmosphere at the fellowship evenings afterwards was not gloomy or depressed. Most members of the Einsatzgruppe enjoyed an evening with their comrades, drinking, playing cards. There was even a party atmosphere sometimes. After a mass killing at Feodosia on the Crimean Peninsula, SKT-10B invited German soldiers who had voluntarily participated in the shooting to a fellowship evening. The men drank a lot and played tricks on each other, such as hiding each other's machine guns. Edward Westerman and Thomas Kühne showed that such evenings created a shared community which included shared responsibility for the killings. Not taking part in it could be seen as non-conformist behavior and as a refusal to take responsibility. 15 to 20 years later, when former members of the Einsatzgruppe were interrogated about their crimes, almost none showed any remorse or problems in coping with what they had done. Their integration into West German society had been smooth. Up until called in for interrogation, most of them had lived normal lives and had not shown any signs of being troubled by the past. It was very important to them to come across as respectable and law-abiding. They did not want to seem weak or antisocial, asocial. They therefore almost always denied having had a drinking problem, even if former comrades stated otherwise. They had internalized the SS values to such an extent that even if they were troubled by what they had done, they would not admit it. There can be no generalizations, however. Some men turned to alcohol in order to cope with their guilty conscience. There were cases where inebriated men turned themselves in after the war, admitting that they had participated in the killing of Jewish people. It was more common, however, that perpetrators bragged about what they had done under the influence of alcohol. Lothar Heimbach, who took the picture of the wine cellar that you saw earlier, got into trouble after his time at the Einsatzgruppe. While stationed at the KDS in Białystok in 1944, he got drunk and lightly exclaimed on the street that he was, quote, master over life and death. If he was ordered to kill 300 children, he would at least kill 150 himself. As this behavior was a lot more common than showing remorse, I would argue that alcohol was not widely needed to cope with crimes. With the crimes. Turning now to Jewish survivors and the question how they coped with what had happened to them after the war. There were, of course, many ways of coping and dealing with trauma by survivors. Some spoke openly about turning to alcohol during or after the war. Returning to the forced labor camp in Pionki, Henry Eisenman, who was about 10 years old at the time, recalled drinking quite a lot of alcohol when he was in the camp. Quote, I was one of the youngest alcoholics around, end of quote. Several survivors stated that they started drinking at a very young age, during or immediately after the war. Ben Finkel, born in 1933, stayed without his parents with non-Jewish Polish partisans. He remembered starting to drink when he was 8 years old. He said the partisan fighters liked him because he drank moonshine with them. There are more cases of children drinking alcohol in order to be accepted by grown-ups. Abraham Deutsch was 12 when he and his mother were liberated from the Mogilev-Podolsky ghetto in Transnistria. He stole bottles of vodka from the retreating Germans and Romanians, which he sold on the black market after his liberation. You used to get a lot for one bottle of vodka, he remembered. He then started working in a shoe factory and had to participate in after-work drinking with the factory workers, right? They gave me a normal-sized glass of vodka, and I had to drink it. If I didn't drink it, they used to hit me. And if I come home drunk, my mother used to hit me, end of quote. Alcohol was also used as an explicit coping mechanism in order to deal with the loss of loved ones, the feeling of loneliness, and survivor's guilt. Even children sometimes used it as a coping mechanism. Stephen and Montrose talks about the first time he tasted alcohol. Montrose, or Rosenberg, at that time was reunited with his father after the war. His mother had died of an illness before the war when he was 6 months old. His father decided to leave Poland. He paid 2 Russian soldiers who smuggled them to Berlin. And Montrose recalls the journey to Berlin.
And that's how we went to Berlin. And after driving in the truck for maybe a day and a half, one evening the Russians stopped the truck and they made a little fire and they made some hot tea and they poured vodka into my tea. And there was the first drink that I had. I was age of 7, and my hand reached out like I wanted another one. And at the age of 7, alcohol became my best friend. Something happened to me when I had that drink. It was like all the fear went away. Not the hate, because I had a tremendous amount of hate in me now, and the anger was there, but it just gave me such a wonderful feeling that I wanted more. And
from then on, he drank regularly, and that is him at about the age when he started drinking. His life story after the war is to a large extent defined by his alcohol consumption. He frequently stated in the interview that alcohol was his best friend, living a normal life. He didn't finish high school, he got into a lot of debt, but still, alcohol was necessary for him. And I quote, "So if I got paid on a Friday, my money was gone on a Friday. In the meantime, my alcohol consumption got more and more, and I started having blackouts. But I had no idea what they were, and I had no idea that it was related to alcohol. I wasn't even thinking like that. All I knew is that when I drank, I felt good. When I drank, I forgot. I didn't have nightmares anymore about the concentration camps." End of quote. When he realized that he had a drinking problem, he could not imagine life without drinking, because it had been his coping mechanism for everything since his early childhood. But eventually he became sober in the early 1980s after almost 40 years of drinking with the help of his wife and AA. Although Monroe's case is extreme, other survivors made similar experiences with alcohol as a coping mechanism. And I would like to show you one last testimony by Helmut Kobler.
As a direct consequence of the concentration camp, I was, 19 years old, going to school. And I was taking, let's say, while I was in the camp, I had never drunk any alcohol, never even known the effect of alcohol or drugs or anything like that. But after the war, then after when I was free and a student, I started tasting alcohol. I loved the effects of it, and I started regularly drinking practically every day. It was practically free, it was good. And just shortly before, a few months before I graduated, I became a drunk in school. I was drunk and became an alcoholic. But I got 3 children.
Stop here for a second. So when he was young and he became alcoholic, he went into rehab and became sober after a while, but he started drinking heavily again in later years. And in this clip, he reflects on how his drinking influenced his children.
Four children who are all heavy drinkers. And it comes from my being an alcoholic at one time.
Did they ever?
I want to show you this testimony because it is an example of how open and emotional some of the survivors talked about their alcohol addiction and its consequences. It's definitely not an easy topic for Kobler to talk about, especially since he feels guilty that his children are also heavy drinkers. I don't know if you noticed, but in many recordings, the interviewers chuckle when the survivors mention alcohol and their use. But often the seemingly funny stories quickly turn into life-threatening situations when dealing with alcohol during the war, for example, or what was fun and comforting at the beginning could develop into a severe illness. I come to my conclusion now. Looking at the use of alcohol during and after the Holocaust allows us to take the perpetrators as well as the victims' experiences into account. The same intoxicant was used very differently and therefore had different effects. Although alcohol was the most commonly used intoxicant, its ambivalent effects made it hard to control. Its strategic use could therefore have unpredictable, often unwanted consequences. Focusing on the use of alcohol might enable us to analyze victims and perpetrators intertwined and sometimes interdependent behavior and experiences, since it frequently led to interactions between them. What I presented today, especially in regard to survivors' use of alcohol, are only first thoughts and need to be analyzed further. It suggests, however, that Jews were not always simply victims of perpetrators' alcohol consumption, but also used it in order to resist and survive. As the consumption of alcohol did not stop when the war ended, its use after the war should also be part of the analysis. Well, in some cases, in particular in the immediate post-war period, it was similar to the wartime years, such as barter, bribery, and black market business. Drinking as a coping mechanism, especially by Jewish survivors, is an example of yet another way to use alcohol, potentially a life-destroying one, which was also a direct consequence of the Holocaust. It underlines once more alcohol's wide-ranging and ambivalent functions, which could be used by the same person in different ways according to the current situation. Thank you very much.
Sina, thank you so much. And now we have time for questions and discussion. So we invite those of you in the room to ask questions, and also just a reminder for those watching on Zoom, you can type questions into the chat, use the Q&A feature, or even the raise hand button if you want to ask your question live, and we'll be moderating the Zoom questions and interspersing them with the people in the room. So do you feel comfortable calling on people in the room?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, you're fine. So first of all, thank you so much for this talk. It's been super interesting, and especially like you're breaking down of the integrated history of this. So thank you for that. I guess my question here is, within the interviews that you were looking at, and you mentioned you listened to 200, did you notice more of a gendered breakdown? Because throughout the testimonies that you talked about, there's one video interview with a woman that you pull out. And so I was wondering if there was more of like a gendered analysis, as well as a little bit more about that like age analysis, I guess, especially with the discussion of the children at the end. So thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Yes, I thought about this as well. I think in regard to the coping mechanism and becoming, an alcoholic after the war, I mostly found men who talked about it. There was one woman or one survivor who stated that her mother became an alcoholic. So these were mostly men. But during the Holocaust, I didn't find the specific gender aspect. So it was just pretty much, whoever, as talked about Clara Biermann and her mother. So it was only women, and they were rescued by women as well. So this was a case where it's just women involved. Obviously, the drinking, when the perpetrators, I only found only men were mentioned. But I mean, it's because there were much more men involved, perpetrators. But yeah, so I would say that in the interviews I looked at, there was like a really clear-cut men, or it was mostly men who dealt with alcohol, for example, on the black market. So, and regarding the age, and I mean, I think this is a kind of bias that you have in all the interviews, because it's just like the people at this kind of age, they were quite young, teenagers. So these were the most people who were still alive in the 1990s or later when the interviews were recorded, and they also had better chances of surviving. So I think this is this kind of bias that you have. But I don't know. I did find it interesting though that there's or I had never thought about it, that children under the age of 10 start drinking regularly. And as I said, in Pyeongchang, for example, you only had this really high grade alcohol. So they drank 90%, 96% of alcohol.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was great. Sarah asked half of my question with the children, but I had a question regarding, you mentioned the reactions such as chuckling, laughing when they were telling their story and the use of alcohol. And I was wondering if you noticed any differences of those reactions between the perpetrators and the victims when they were retelling their use of alcohol. And thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question as well. Yeah, so as I said, so the interviewers sometimes chuckle, but also as we've seen with Minna Aspler, a lot of the survivors, when they talk about alcohol or their use of alcohol, they always tell it as a kind of funny story. Sometimes they can smart on perpetrators, and so it's always they succeed and surviving. So they mostly recall it as like interesting and somewhat and funny. And when the perpetrators talk about alcohol during their interrogation, they mostly also talk about it in like a funny way. They remember it fondly, having a good time with their comrades. And most of the time, because the interrogators asked frequently about their alcohol consumption, because they wanted to find out whether alcohol was used during the massacring. But the perpetrators, the former Einsatzgruppe members mostly talked about their kind of everyday consumption or their festive consumption. So they had a lot of parties or holidays and where they drank alcohol, and they mostly remember it as having a good time. So that's also, mostly they remember it as also a funny or fond memory.
Okay, there's a question on Zoom. Sorry, Wolf. From Tom Tierney. Thank you, Dr. Fabian, for your great analysis on this topic. I'm curious if you encountered any mention of medicinal uses of alcohol by Jewish victims during the war, such as its use as an antiseptic agent or as a painkiller for an improvised medical procedure.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, I did found some mention of it. So for example, then especially with the high grade alcohol, so the 96% proof. So this could very well be used for if you had wounds to as a disinfectant. So they do mention that. They also mention sometimes in the religious context, so that they used it to perform their religious rituals. But I didn't come across it that often. So usually, if they got hold of alcohol, and if they didn't need it for another purpose, such as disinfecting a wound, for example, they would barter it mostly for food.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really illuminating. I want to pick up on Sarah's question with the kind of the gender distribution here. And you said during the war there's no difference. Since you worked also in Weimar, can you give us a little bit of an insight what was actually drinking, kind of gender-wise drinking practice, and how much is it also influenced by social status and social kind of levels, so class? And does this has something also to do then with the war?
So you mean like the general alcohol consumption in Weimar? Mm-hmm. I would say that if we look at problematic alcohol consumption, because during the Weimar years, there was a lot of debates and talk about problematic drinking and how we can regulate it. So it's mostly always men who are seen as having a drinking problem. And women, for example, female politicians, they advocate very much for regulating alcohol consumption. So there is still, even though we know the kind of new woman, we know that women also started drinking alcohol. In the kind of discussion, it was very much gender bias. So it was really men were the target group, men were the problem drinkers, women were the ones who suffered. And so you see all this kind of activism to regulate alcohol is very much led by women. Women, I think that women, especially young women, who weren't married yet and who had a job, they did drink, but I think the time when women really kind of participated in drinking was after World War II. So, and then we see kind of like consumption level going through the roof, and that was mostly because of women starting drinking and young people, because they now get money and the kind of social restrictions are lifting. So even though we know this kind of, I don't know, series like Babylon Berlin or whatever, kind of have this image that women are partying all the time, getting drunk, using drugs. This is, I don't think that is based on actual historical evidence.
Yeah, so let me join in the chorus to thank you for this really illuminating lecture. I think it's so kind of elegant the way you use alcohol as a commodity, as an intoxicant, as a coping mechanism, and show how the different groups, there's this one thing that's kind of bringing all these different groups together, but they're using it in different ways. It's really beautiful structure to that. So what really intrigues me is about the argument you're making about the perpetrators, and you're clearly very conscientious about not exculpating them, not kind of showing that they're only able to commit atrocities when under the influence. So that got me thinking about the Norman Ohler book, and you probably get asked a lot, but you mentioned drugs a couple times, but didn't really get into it, and I found that book very problematic for a few reasons, including, I see you agree, including this idea that I feel like it kind of, in some ways, minimizes the guilt of Nazi perpetrators. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that, and if you kind of are also talking about drug use in your project at all, either in Weimar or in the Nazi period.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Norman Ohler's book is very problematic indeed, and it hasn't been widely received in academia, and if it's mentioned or if it's looked at, then it's always criticized. And I think it's true. I don't I don't agree with his findings at all. So it's funny because I listened to a talk by Ed Westerman, and he was asked the same thing. So he would always refer to, you know, the Norman Ohler book has received very wide attention outside academia as well. For example, I also looked at the alcohol consumption of Wehrmacht soldiers. And I looked at the Wehrmacht files, and you find barely no mention of drug use at all. So this is not perceived as a problem. So you know, there are lots and lots of orders saying like, stop drinking, you know, it's dangerous, you get hurt, la 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 la. But it's always in connection with alcohol. There's never anything about do not use drugs. So this drug use really did not come up at all in my research, not in the Einsatzgruppe either. So there's no mention of it at all. And regarding Weimar Germany, and again, I think it's like this kind of popular image that we have from Weimar is very much exaggerated, or very much exaggerates the use of drugs. So there are good studies on it, and they pretty much come to the finding that there is almost no evidence that there is drugs were used widely. And you can also see that in the research. There's a doctoral thesis on death of Wehrmacht soldiers from alcohol and drug use, and those there are basically no death from drug use, and most is overwhelmingly from alcohol use. So it is like in Weimar Germany, it is just like on the kind of discourse level, it is sometimes discussed, but it's like still alcohol is called as a Volkskrankheit. So it's very much overshadowed, and I think because it's very like a niche thing that is popularized in our kind of image from Weimar Germany. And I mean, just another thing, this also the argument that if people use drugs, then it's mostly, for example, physicians. And so this is kind of a group, that you would not normally associate with drug use. And so this is kind of not problematized because it's often like the groups in high profile groups like physicians who get easy access to drugs.
I noticed that you talked a little bit about the situation where there was like 5 liters per man available, but also the alcohol being used for bartering. So were there any supply issues throughout the war? Like there was more alcohol use at the beginning and tapered off at the end, or was there like constant supply from the different regions?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so it's very important to look at the region. So if you look to France, for example, there is no shortage of supply at all. So there is always and you have this kind of conflict between soldiers who are stationed in France and soldiers who are in the East. And so it's always this thing that, soldiers who are stationed in France, they just having a good time. They drink, they have all the luxury products, consumption, so they just, having a good time, whereas in the East, the soldiers are suffering, and the Wehrmacht is very interested in continuing alcohol supply for soldiers. So there is the Wehrmacht always comes first, and there isn't, in theory, there isn't such a shortage in supply, but they don't get the alcohol to the soldiers in the East. So and during the Einsatzgruppe was mostly at work in 1941-42, and at this time there isn't so much of a problem, supply problem, but it gets worse. The longer the war continues, and when the defeat is looming on the horizon and they have to retreat, so then the supply is very, meager, and the soldiers start just looking anywhere for alcohol. And these are always also the situations when there are also quite a lot of Wehrmacht soldiers dying from drinking denatured alcohol. So alcohol, they should say it's not good for drinking. And so the Wehrmacht's always also reminding them, do not get alcohol from local people and so on. But yeah, so death from denatured alcohol rise at the same time when the alcohol supply sinks or decreases.
Great paper, thank you so much. I was wondering, what role did non-drinking play? So people actively deciding not to drink.
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. Yeah, they were pretty much outsiders in the perpetrators group. It doesn't happen often, so there are very few who kind of refuse to drink. And you know, as I said, if you didn't participate in this kind of bonding, comradeship, then you were an outcast. And participating in it, you had to drink. So there are just a few at the Einsatzgruppe. I mean, after the interrogation, they can use it. They were like, yeah, I was an outcast. I didn't say. There was one man who was kind of leading a small unit, and he said he got in trouble because he didn't organize a Christmas party for his men. So, and then they went to Ohlendorf and complained about him because he was like, I don't want to get them drunk, la la la. And so he got in trouble, and because he was not socializing enough with his men and not organizing this huge party that all the other units did. So, and especially for like officers, they were in like, well, it was difficult for them because they were kind of, the Nazis demanded them to drink. So it was really like, okay, you have to socialize with your men. You cannot, be above the men. So they had to drink, but on the other hand, they also had to be the role model who would never lose self-control to drunk. And there also then in the later years, there's also an order that they had to take care of their men. So if their men got drunk and did something stupid, the officer was blamed. So yeah, but I think in order to really participate in the male bonding and male grouping, you did have to drink.
There's a question.
You can see me over here. But just sort of the flip side of that question, which is, did you look at all the cultural attitudes of Jews towards alcohol? So I was kind of struck by that one woman's testimony, and if I understood it correctly, where she said, I had to act like I wasn't a Jew, I had to drink. And I just wondered if maybe not so much in this very specific part of your research that you talked about, but even in the bigger picture that you looked into, like cultural attitudes of Jews toward alcohol.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. I need to look more into that because it is interesting. Some of the survivors, some of the Polish Jewish survivors, they would kind of set themselves apart from the non-Jewish Polish people. And I remember one testimony by a female survivor. So she was talking about how their cultural or their culture was so much different from the Christian Poles, and she refers to weddings especially, and she says, well, Jewish weddings, so we all love each other, we kiss each other, we're having a good time. And the Polish weddings, they just get drunk, they get into fights, and so she's, it's very interesting because this thing, and as you mentioned, Mina Aspla, that's also, I think she also refers to that. She's like, so I have to pretend that I'm, non-Jewish Pole, so I have to drink a lot. But that's a very good point. I need to look more into that, and also the Stephen Montrose that I showed, who started drinking at a very young age, he said he went to AA meetings in, I think, Catholic churches or in Christian churches. And he said, well, for some reasons, the rabbis think Jewish people don't get addicted to alcohol.
I can think, that's why I asked you the question, because I think and it's a misconception among Jewish families that Jews don't drink to excess, or that there's not an alcohol problem in Jewish culture, but of course there is in every culture. But so that's why I just thought might be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I really want to look more into it, and it's interesting because Montrose was kind of involved with the kind of mafia in Philadelphia, so he says. But he said, well, I had to kind of sneak into the Catholic or the Christian churches, because if his kind of Jewish mafia connections would have seen him, he would have gotten into trouble. And there's also one survivor. She talks about that she opened up one of the first rehab clinics in Israel. I don't remember in which region, but so it's in the 1980s. And she said there isn't much or many rehab clinics there. So she moved from the US to Israel and started taking care of people with an alcohol addiction.
I was just wondering, is it, so what was used to distill alcohol usually? Is it some indications of in the interviews or what you research?
Yeah, I mean, most of the, for example, they use this high-grade alcohol, for example. So if they got from military purposes, for example, like in the Jumping Labor camp, so if they got hold of this very high-grade alcohol, so they would water it down and just make liquor from it, add juices or so. Minna Asper recalls that her friend who does this in his basement, he had been to France studying how to make liquor. And so he could use his knowledge. And she also says they used candy from the library to kind of produce the liquor. So I think they also use this high-grade alcohol. And then kind of use it to make liquor that she could then sell to these fancy restaurants. But yeah, they don't talk about it too much how they produce it. So they just kind of say, well, we got it from somewhere, but it's a very good point that I need to look into further to how they actually produce it.
I want to come back to this question of the ambivalence of alcohol and when the perpetrator used it. And you referred to some army orders to kind of contain the abuse of alcohol. So I wonder, first of all, when you looked at the SS and the Einsatzgruppe, are there similar kind of orders? Because they have also to kind of manage this problem of, on the one hand, you mentioned that they use it to kind of get people over this first hump, but then also if it's abused, it can be also kind of lack of discipline, and so they have also a mission. So can you elaborate a little bit on this? And following up on this, you mentioned in the beginning that people previously thought the alcohol would kind of enable people to kill. And you kind of made some points, but I want you just to emphasize what your standpoint is, what you think is kind of happening with the Einsatzgruppe and alcohol. Just to summarize this.
So I mean, to get into Himmler's attitude towards alcohol, we'll be here tomorrow. Peter Longrich's book on Himmler, so it's very good. There's also a lot about his attitude towards alcohol, and so he is at the beginning. He's very strict. In the 1930s, he's very strict about alcohol consumption, and he has this kind of paternal way, you know, if SS men drink too much, get into trouble. So he's being like behaving almost, you know, in his, if you like a father telling his kind of sons off. But then during the war, he actually opens up a kind of rehab clinic for SS men who have an alcohol problem. It's at Dachau concentration camp. And I didn't find that many who actually were there. I found one perpetrator who got into trouble frequently for drinking, and then he's sent to this kind of rehab clinic. These kind of Wehrmacht orders, they later on they come from Himmler, because he takes control of police and everything, and then lots of the orders come from him. But I mean, I'm planning kind of to do this, the kind of efforts to control alcohol via these orders and everything, and bringing them to court, to justice. I plan to do this in 2 separate chapters with the Einsatzgruppe D, because this does not, you know, it doesn't play any role. So there are some men who drink too much at the Einsatzgruppe D, just very few, and they are either sent to other units or they sent back to the Reich. But Ohlendorf writes that at one point to his wife, he says, well, there are like a few weak elements, but they don't count. So there isn't. But on the other hand, and this leads me to your second question, alcohol consumption in general among the Einsatzgruppe, among the men, were very high, I think. So I think there is a very high level of tolerating alcohol consumption. And as long as you could function, that was fine, you know. So, and I think almost it was a bigger problem if you didn't drink than when you drank too much. And yeah, regarding the question, was alcohol needed for the mass killings? Ohlendorf was asked in his Nuremberg interrogations, was asked the same question. So he was asked, did your man got alcohol for the mass killings? And he said something like, ausnahmsweise, yeah. So not, you know, he said not in general, but sometimes yes. And I think this actually describes it quite well. For certain situations or certain killings, I think they did get alcohol. For example, if I said during the first killings, so the first inhibition, to overcome the inhibition, and if it was like kind of an extraordinary killing, like very large, you know, like very large killings, for example. So I think there is this kind of, you know, at certain situations on certain occasions, but I think it depended very much on the officers in charge. So they had quite, you know, they in the end they could decide whether they give out alcohol or not. And it depended, as I said, I think it depends very much on the attitude, the supervisor's attitude. If he had like a very relaxed, like Bruno Müller, he, you know, kind of forced his officers to drink with him a lot, to the point that they didn't want to, they were complaining about him. And then you had other officers who did not, you know, who were very strict and saying, well, the SS values forbid the drinking, you have to be strong enough to do it without the alcohol. So it depended very much on the kind of whoever was in charge of the killing.
All right, thank you so much, Sina.
Thank you.
I think your project is such a compelling example of the way the testimonies can expand our point of view and our perspective. And along those lines, I just want to plug that the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research currently has fellowship application period open for senior scholars, PhD candidates, and USC students. And you can learn more about that on our website. And we are finalizing our spring calendar, which will be announced soon, and we invite you all both online and in person to come back next semester. And yes, all our lectures are recorded and put onto our YouTube channel, where you can also watch past lectures and share this exciting lecture with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you.